In a neighborhood where every blade of grass was measured and every smile had rules, one quiet man planted a single tomato in memory of his wife. But that small act of love broke the silence of fear. When a $50 fine turned into a symbol of control, Arthur Penhaligon, a retired professor who only wanted peace, found himself standing against a system that punished kindness and rewarded obedience. What began as a harmless plant soon became a spark, the spark that would challenge the queen of conformity and ignite the first rebellion in the perfect little world of Maple Creek. Arthur Penhaligon believed he had purchased a slice of the American dream when he signed the closing papers for 124 Primrose Lane in the idyllic, sun-drenched community of Maple Creek Estates. But he would soon discover he had actually bought a front-row seat to a suburban psychodrama, a meticulously landscaped battlefield where the grass was always cut to exactly 2.5 inches, and freedom died a quiet death by 1,000 violation notices. A retired history professor from a crowded, noisy Midwestern city, Arthur had yearned for tranquility, for a place where his most pressing concern would be whether to plant petunias or zinnias next to the mailbox, a mailbox that he would soon learn had to be the Heritage Black Classic, model W74B and no other. The community on the surface was a testament to cooperative perfection. Every lawn was a verdant carpet, every house painted in one of 3 pre-approved shades of beige, and every driveway was power washed to a state of pristine, oil-stain-free glory. This unnerving uniformity he initially thought was a small price to pay for peace. He had not yet met Carol Covington, the HOA president, a woman who wielded the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions handbook not as a guide, but as a holy scripture and a blunt force weapon. Arthur's first encounter with Carol's reign was subtle. A canary in the coal mine of suburban tyranny, a crisp, white envelope tucked under his windshield wiper, informing him that his recycling bin had been visible from the street for 1 hour and 17 minutes, past the 8 a.m. post-pickup deadline, a level 1 infraction that carried a warning but hinted at the dark, punitive depths of levels 2 and 3. He chuckled, crumpling the notice and tossing it, attributing it to an overzealous volunteer. But then came the matter of the gnome. It was a whimsical gift from his daughter, a cheerful red-hatted fellow he placed under a Japanese maple in his front yard. Within a day, another envelope appeared, this time with a photograph of the offending gnome, circled in red ink, and a citation for an unapproved lawn ornament, a violation of Bylaw 17 Section C subsection D. This time the notice was signed with the imperious flourish of Carol Covington herself. Arthur, a man who had dedicated his life to studying the rise and fall of empires, began to see the familiar patterns of absolute power corrupting absolutely. The final straw the shot heard round the cul-de-sac was the heirloom tomato plant. It was a Cherokee purple, a variety his late wife had adored, and he planted the small seedling in a sunny spot in his front flower bed, a small, living tribute to her memory. It was not a pre-approved perennial. 2 days later, as he was watering it, a golf cart, the unofficial chariot of HOA authority, silently glided to a halt at his curb. Carol Covington emerged, clad in her uniform of a crisp white visor, a pastel polo shirt and khaki shorts, a clipboard held firmly against her chest. She wasn't tall, but she radiated an aura of immense, unassailable authority. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, a perfect match for the soulless perfection of the neighborhood. "We have an issue." She gestured with her pen towards the tiny tomato plant. "That is a vegetable. As you know or should know if you read the documentation provided at closing, all front-facing landscaping must be purely ornamental. Vegetables are restricted to backyard container gardening, pending approval from the Architectural Review Committee of which I am the chair." Arthur, staring at the woman who was passing judgment on a 2-inch plant, felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. It was about one person's desperate need to sand down the interesting edges of the world until everything was smooth, predictable, and utterly under her command. He looked from the fragile plant, a symbol of his past and his quiet rebellion, to Carol's unblinking eyes, and he knew his peaceful retirement was over. He had not moved to Maple Creek Estates to be policed. He had come to live, and if a war had to be fought over a single tomato plant, then Arthur Penhaligon, a student of history's great conflicts, would make damn sure he was on the right side of it, ready to dig in and defend his small patch of earth. Arthur looked from Carol Covington's granite-hard face to the tiny green leaves of the Cherokee purple, and felt a calm resolve settle over him, the kind he'd only read about in accounts of men standing on the precipice of great and often foolish decisions. "Mrs. Covington," he began, his voice even and professorial, "this plant is not a vegetable in the common sense. It is a memorial. It is, for all intents and purposes, purely ornamental to me, as its value is in its existence, not its fruit. Furthermore, it is causing no harm, it is not an eyesore, and it is on my property. It stays." Carol's eyes narrowed to tiny slits, the cheerful suburban sun glinting off her visor in a way that suddenly felt menacing. She made a sharp, deliberate mark on her clipboard. "The violation has been noted, Mr. Penhaligon. You will receive a formal notice of non-compliance. You have 7 days to cure the violation. Failure to do so will result in a $50 fine, and subsequent fines for every week the violation remains." She didn't wait for a reply, simply turned on her heel, climbed back into her golf cart and glided away, a silent phantom of order leaving a wake of discord. That evening, for the first time since moving in, Arthur ignored the blooming azaleas and the perfectly manicured lawn. Instead, he retrieved the thick 3-ring binder from his study, the one ominously titled Maple Creek Estates Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. He poured himself a glass of iced tea, put on his reading glasses, and began to read. For hours he immersed himself in the labyrinthine text, a document so dense with legalese, so specific in its prohibitions, from the precise Pantone color of acceptable front door, paint to the maximum allowable decibel level of wind chimes, a paltry figure that he felt he was excavating the legal code of some petty ancient kingdom. As a historian, he saw it all. The fear of chaos, the thirst for absolute control, the slow, bureaucratic strangling of individual spirit. He highlighted, he underlined. He made notes in the margins, looking for an opening, a contradiction, a loophole just large enough to drive a revolution through. The next morning, on a walk that was less about exercise and more about reconnaissance, he saw the neighborhood with new eyes. He saw the flicker of desperation in Mr. Garcia's face at 131 Primrose, as he frantically shoved his son's bright blue plastic slide behind a bush before heading to work. He noticed Mrs. Gable at 119 quickly snatch a small unapproved welcome flag from her flower pot as a white golf cart turned the corner at the end of the street. These weren't happy residents. They were compliant subjects living under the watchful eye of a benevolent dictator. He was not alone. Returning home, he found it taped to his Heritage Black Classic mailbox, a sterile, computer-printed letter detailing violation NAR B17SC2, complete with photographic evidence of the offending tomato plant and a formal invoice for $50, due in 1 week should the botanical infraction not be rectified. Arthur slowly peeled the notice from the mailbox. He looked at the invoice, then at the small, defiant plant, its leaves reaching for the sun. The $50 fine wasn't a penalty. It was a declaration of war, and Arthur Penhaligon, armed with a history of human conflict and a highlighted copy of the CCNRs, was finally ready to draft his terms of engagement. Arthur slowly peeled the violation notice from his mailbox, the adhesive making a sound like a tiny, defeated sigh. $50. For real? He muttered to himself, his academic calm finally cracking. He stared at the invoice, a flimsy piece of paper that somehow carried the weight of a royal decree. You gotta be kidding me. This wasn't about a plant anymore. It was extortion. Plain and simple, dressed up in the khaki shorts of community standards. The fine wasn't the point. It was the principle, a line drawn in his perfectly manicured St. Augustine grass. He looked at the small, defiant tomato plant, its leaves reaching for the sun, and knew his highlighted copy of the CCNRs wasn't enough. He needed allies. That afternoon, armed with a plate of homemade oatmeal cookies his daughter had insisted he learn to bake, he walked over to 131 Primrose Lane. He found Mr. Garcia in his garage, meticulously organizing a set of wrenches. Garcia saw him coming, and his body language immediately tightened. He glanced nervously up and down the street as if expecting Carol Covington's golf cart to materialize from thin air. "Hey there," Arthur said, offering a friendly smile and the plate of cookies. "Arthur Penhaligon from 124. I just wanted to introduce myself properly." Garcia wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes cautious. Carlos Garcia. Nice to meet you. Thanks for the cookies, man. The man was a small olive branch, a sign of casual camaraderie. Listen, Carlos, Arthur began, lowering his voice. I don't want to cause any trouble, but I got a notice today. About a plant. Carlos's face fell into a look of weary recognition. Geez, don't tell me. The tomato plant, right? Yeah, my wife saw Carol giving you the evil eye yesterday. You gotta be careful, Art. She and her board get totally bent out of shape over the smallest things. Arthur nodded, feeling a spark of validation. She's fining me $50. It's just nuts. Carlos let out a short, bitter laugh. Tell me about it. Last month I left my kid's portable basketball hoop at the edge of the driveway overnight. Totally my bad, I was beat after a long day. They slapped me with a $100 fine for unapproved recreational structures. It's a total racket. This was it, the common ground. So the bottom line is, Arthur said, choosing his words carefully, we're all just supposed to roll over and pay up? Carlos shrugged, his shoulders slumping. What are you gonna do? Fighting them is a nightmare. My neighbor tried to fight them over the color of his window shutters. It was one shade off the approved list, and it became a whole can of worms. Legal fees, constant inspections, it just wasn't worth the hassle. It's a real pain in the neck. Arthur looked from Carlos's frustrated face back toward his own house where the tiny plant stood as a symbol of his quiet rebellion. Maybe, he said softly, but I think I'm gonna give it a shot. I'm not looking to start a war just to get the skinny on how to push back a little. It's no biggie, but maybe if one person stands up, others will too. Carlos looked at Arthur. A flicker of something, hope perhaps, or just morbid curiosity in his eyes, and for the first time since the conversation started, he genuinely smiled. The brief conversation with Carlos was the spark Arthur needed. It transformed his personal grievance into a potential movement. He knew direct confrontation with Carol was a losing battle. As a historian, he understood that you don't charge headfirst into a fortified position. You undermine it from within. His new strategy began not with a protest sign but with a flyer. That night, he designed a simple, inoffensive notice on his computer. It read, "Concerned about rising fines and confusing rules? Want to have a friendly chat about our community? Let's get together for coffee and conversation. Saturday, 10 a.m., my backyard at 124 Primrose Lane. Let's make Maple Creek a community, not just a corporation." He avoided any mention of Carol, the board, or specific violations. It was vanilla, neighborly, and, most importantly, technically compliant with every bylaw in the CC&R handbook. He printed 50 copies. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen and the neighborhood's self-appointed patrols were active, he embarked on what he mentally dubbed the midnight ride of Arthur Penhaligon. He walked the quiet, perfectly uniformed streets, tucking a flyer into the side of each Heritage Black Classic model, Drew 74B mailbox. It felt subversive. A small act of rebellion cloaked in the mundanity of a neighborhood potluck invitation. By the time Carol Covington made her morning rounds in her silent electric chariot, the seeds of dissent had already been sown. For the next few days, the air in Maple Creek Estates was thick with unspoken tension. Arthur received polite but distant nods from some neighbors, while others avoided his gaze entirely, as if his flyer was contagious. He knew Carol must have seen it. He braced himself for another violation notice, perhaps for unauthorized solicitation or improper use of mail receptacles. But nothing came. The silence was more unnerving than an open threat. It was clear Carol was playing it cool, waiting to see if his little coffee chat would fizzle out on its own. Saturday morning arrived, cloudy and uncertain. Arthur set up a folding table in his backyard, hidden from street view by his house and a row of fully approved ficus hedges. He had a large carafe of coffee, a stack of paper cups, and the plate of oatmeal cookies, now feeling more like a peace offering than bait. At 9:55 a.m., his backyard was empty. He felt a pang of disappointment, a fear that Carlos was right, that everyone was too intimidated to show up. He was a general with no army. Then at 10:02, a figure appeared at the side of his house. Carlos Garcia, carrying a bag of donuts. "Figured you could use some backup," he said with a grin. A minute later, Mrs. Gable from 119, the woman who had snatched her welcome flag, arrived, her hands nervously clutching a small notebook. Soon another couple appeared. Then a quiet man Arthur recognized from down the street who had been fined for his grass being a quarter-inch too long. By 10:15, there were 8 people huddled in Arthur's backyard. a small anxious gathering of the mildly oppressed. They spoke in hushed tones at first, sharing stories like confessions. The basketball hoop, the wrong shade of beige on a fence, the holiday decorations that were left up 12 hours too late. It was a cascade of petty tyrannies. "It's not just the money," Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's the feeling of being watched. All the time. I'm afraid to plant a new rosebush without getting a lawyer." Arthur listened, letting them all vent. This wasn't a time for speeches. It was a time for solidarity. "She's up for re-election next month," Carlos pointed out, munching on a donut. "The president. But no one ever runs against her. It's a sham." A silence fell over the group as the implication of Carlos's words hung in the air. They all looked at Arthur, the quiet professor who had dared to plant a tomato and call a meeting. He hadn't planned for this. He just wanted to keep his memorial plant. But as he looked at the faces of his neighbors, he saw the same yearning for a little bit of freedom that he felt. The re-election was the weak point in Carol's fortress. He hadn't wanted a war, but he was starting to realize he might be the only one willing to lead the charge. The word re-election hung in the air, shifting the entire dynamic of the backyard meeting. What started as a simple gripe session was now tiptoeing into the realm of a political coup. All eyes were on Arthur, the reluctant revolutionary. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of their expectations. "I'll be honest," he started. "I just wanted to save my tomato plant. I'm not a politician. But Carlos has a point. The system is the problem, not just the fines, and the only way to change the system is from the inside." The quiet man, whose name they learned was Dave, spoke up for the first time. "It's a gutsy move, man. Carol plays hardball. She's got the management company and the HOA lawyers on speed dial. Anyone who runs against her is going to be under a microscope. She'll find every little infraction, real or imagined." Mrs. Gable nodded vigorously. "He's right. It would be a total dumpster fire. My husband says to just let it go. It's not worth the stress." A wave of defeatism washed over the small group. The initial energy began to drain away, replaced by the familiar fear of the status quo. They had come for coffee, not a crusade. Arthur knew he was losing them. He had to pivot. "Okay, let's pump the brakes," he said, holding up his hands. "Nobody's talking about a full-blown campaign today. That's way out of left field. Let's start smaller. The first step isn't to win an election. It's to show her we're not just going to roll over anymore." He picked up his copy of the CC&Rs, the one filled with his highlighted notes. "For instance, did you know that any petition signed by just 10% of homeowners requires the board to hold a special town hall meeting to address the issue? It's right here, Article 5, Section 2. A murmur went through the group. They had all received the binder, but none had read it. It was just the big scary book of rules. Carlos's eyes lit up. "So you're saying we don't have to wait for the election? We can force a meeting to talk about the fines?" "Exactly," Arthur confirmed. "We don't attack Carol. We don't even attack the board. We just formally petition for a community meeting to clarify the fine assessment and appeals process. It's procedural. It's boring. And it's completely by the book. There's no way she can legally refuse it without showing her hand." This was a strategy they could understand. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a bureaucratic maneuver. It was safe. "I'm in," Carlos said immediately. "That's a no-brainer." Mrs. Gable, looking less nervous, added, "A petition? I could get my next-door neighbor to sign. She got fined because her welcome mat had words on it." Dave, the quiet man, gave a slow nod. "Okay, I can get on board with that. It's a solid plan." The mood had shifted again. They weren't plotting a revolution. They were forming a committee. It was less threatening, more suburban. Arthur felt a sense of relief. He had them back. As the group dispersed, they agreed to discreetly gather signatures over the next week. The goal was small and achievable. But as Arthur cleaned up the coffee cups, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a point of no return. He was no longer just the guy with the illegal tomato plant. He was now the leader of the Maple Creek Estates Clarification Committee, a title that sounded both ridiculous and dangerously significant. His quiet retirement was officially over. The week of gathering signatures was an education in suburban sociology. Arthur, Carlos, Dave, and a nervous but resolute Mrs. Gable divided the neighborhood map and set out, clipboards in hand. It was a mixed bag, to say the least. Some doors opened to faces filled with immediate relief. Homeowners who eagerly signed the petition and whispered their own horror stories about Carol Covington's reign. "It's about time someone did something," one man said, signing with a flourish after describing his fine for having a garden hose that was not the approved shade of forest green. But for every easy signature, there were 3 doors that were a tough nut to crack. Many residents would listen patiently, nod in agreement, but then refuse to sign. "I'm with you in spirit," a woman whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But Carol's a friend of my sister-in-law. I can't get in the middle of it. You know how it is." The fear was palpable, a low-grade fever running through the pristine streets of Maple Creek. By Thursday, they had collected 23 signatures, just shy of the 30 they needed to hit the 10% threshold. The momentum was slowing. And then Carol made her move. It wasn't a fine or a direct confrontation. It was smarter, more insidious. An email blast went out to every homeowner from the official HOA address. The subject line was, "A friendly reminder, maintaining community harmony." The email, written in Carol's signature passive-aggressive prose, spoke of the importance of unity and warned residents against divisive, unofficial petitions that may be circulating based on misinformation. It reminded everyone that the board was working diligently to protect property values, and that all concerns should be addressed through official channels, not through disruptive neighborhood gatherings. She didn't name Arthur, but she didn't have to. The message was clear: pick a side. That evening, the clarification committee gathered again in Arthur's backyard, the mood significantly heavier than before. "So she got wind of it," Dave stated, summing up the situation. "Her friendly reminder has spooked a lot of people. The last 3 houses I went to basically shut the door in my face." Mrs. Gable wrung her hands. "I knew this would happen. She's turning the whole neighborhood against us before we even begin." Just then, Carlos arrived, his face grim. He wasn't carrying donuts this time. "You guys are not going to believe this," he said, pacing back and forth. "I just talked to Mr. Henderson down on Willow Lane. He signed our petition yesterday morning. A real nice old guy grows prize-winning roses." Carlos stopped pacing and looked at them. "This morning he got a violation notice. A $100 fine for improper storage of gardening chemicals. His bag of Miracle-Gro was barely visible behind his air conditioning unit. It's payback. It's a shot across the bow." A chilling silence fell over the group. This changed everything. It was no longer about procedural debates. Carol was now actively punishing their supporters. The risk was no longer theoretical. Mrs. Gable looked like she was about to cry. "I can't ask people to sign if it means they'll be targeted. This is wrong." Arthur felt the plan slipping away. His strategy of using the rules against the ruler was failing, because the ruler was willing to break them in spirit, if not in letter. He had to hold them together. "Don't you see?" he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "This isn't a sign of her strength. This is a sign of her desperation. She's not playing it cool anymore. She's freaking out. She's making mistakes. A random vindictive fine against an old man with a rose garden. That doesn't look like strong leadership. That looks petty. That looks weak." He looked at each of them. "We needed 30 signatures. We have 23. We just need 7 more brave people. And now, thanks to Carol, we have a new story to tell when we knock on their doors. We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for Mr. Henderson." His words hung in the air, reframing Carol's attack as an opportunity. It was a gamble, but it was the only move he had left. Arthur's words reframed the narrative, turning Carol's intimidation tactic into a weapon they could use against her. But before anyone could commit to this risky new strategy, a new figure stepped out of the evening shadows and into the dim light of Arthur's patio. It was an older woman with a kind but determined face, her hands twisting a handkerchief. It was Mrs. Henderson, the wife of the man who had been fined for his Miracle-Gro. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I heard you were meeting. My herald told me what you were trying to do. He was afraid after he got the fine, but I'm not afraid. I'm angry. What Carol did to him after all the years he spent making his roses beautiful for this neighborhood. It's just not right." She looked directly at Arthur. "Give me that clipboard. I'll sign. And I know 3 of my neighbors on Willow Lane who are fed up and will sign too, once they hear what happened to my herald. That woman has gone too far." A wave of pure, electrifying energy shot through the small group. Mrs. Henderson's courage was the final push they needed. By the next day, they had 32 signatures. Arthur drafted a formal letter, attached the petition, and hand-delivered it to the HOA management office. officially invoking Article 5, Section 2. The town hall meeting was held the following week in the sterile beige community center. The air was thick with tension. Carol Covington and the two other board members sat at a long table at the front, looking severe and unamused. Arthur, Carlos, Mrs. Gable, Dave, and the Hendersons sat in the front row. About 40 other residents were scattered throughout the room, their faces a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Carol opened the meeting with a condescending smile. It seems there has been some confusion regarding our community's well-established fine assessment process, she began, her tone suggesting she was speaking to unruly children. This meeting was called to address this supposed confusion. Arthur stood up, his copy of the CCNRs in hand. He wasn't angry. He was academic. He calmly laid out the purpose of the petition, citing the need for transparency and a clearer, more humane appeals process. He spoke not of tyranny, but of procedural ambiguity. Carol tried to cut him off, claiming the processes were perfectly clear, but then Mrs. Gable, shaking like a leaf, stood up. "My heart is in my throat," she stammered, "but I have to say something. I was fined because my welcome mat said welcome. I felt like a criminal. That's not community. That's just mean." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Then Carlos stood. "And let's talk about the $100 fine for a bag of fertilizer that appeared the day after Mr. Henderson signed this petition," he said, his voice booming in the quiet room. "You can call it procedure, Carol, but everyone in this room knows what it really is. It's payback." The room went silent. The accusation hung in the air, undeniable. For the first time, Carol Covington looked flustered. Her authority, built on fear and unquestioned rule, had a crack in it. She was being challenged publicly, and the residents were listening. She saw the tide turning. Being a shrewd politician, she quickly shifted tactics to save face. "Of course," she said, her voice suddenly smooth and accommodating. "The board is always open to feedback. Perhaps it is time we form a subcommittee to review the appeals process. Mr. Penhaligon, perhaps you would be willing to chair it." It was a classic political move, an attempt to bury the problem in bureaucracy, but it was a public concession. It was a victory. Later that evening, Arthur stood in his backyard looking at a small tomato plant. It had survived. The $50 fine had been graciously waived by Carol pending the review committee's findings. He had won the battle. Carlos walked over from his yard holding 2 bottles of beer. "To the clarification committee," he said, handing one to Arthur. "You did it, man. You really stuck it to her." Arthur took a long sip. "This isn't over, Carlos. This was just round 1. The re-election is next month. That's the main event." Carlos grinned. "Well, then it's a good thing we found our candidate." Arthur looked at his neighbor, then back at the small, resilient plant that had started it all. A quiet smile touched his lips. He had never wanted to be a politician, but he had learned in the past few weeks that sometimes, to protect the things you care about, you can't just cultivate your own garden. Sometimes you have to run the whole farm. His quiet retirement was officially over. His campaign had just begun.